Hey everybody, hope you're doing great today. We're going to be jumping into our next set of topics this week, which we'll spend 2 weeks on overall. But before we do that, I want to recap just real quick what we looked at last time. So remember last time, we just started off trying to get a sense of what logic is, and this is really going to take all semester to fully internalize just what we mean by logic. Right, but we at least want to start off trying to differentiate it between differentiate it from just thinking about it in terms of just common sense or just like intuition, right? So the idea is that logic is the study of good inferences. Right, and those inferences can be on anything, right? On any sort of content whatsoever, right? We make inferences on biology, on physics, right? In terms of crime, like all these sorts of things we talked about last week, right? It's just the idea that we move from some sort of information or evidence or premises or principles or axioms or what have you, and try to figure out what follows from that, right? What are the results of a certain set of principles or evidence or whatever, right? And so logic is the study of just what are the good ways of doing this and what are the bad ways of doing this. So we articulate these inferences in terms of arguments, which just means we're going to lay out in terms of statements what are the premises, right? And then in terms of a statement, what is the conclusion? Right? So what are those starting points? What are those principles or pieces of evidence or assumptions or what have you that we're beginning with? And what is it that we're supposed to be justifying, right? What is it that we're supposed to be trying to support? Right. And so an argument is just a way of trying to make very clear what is it that our inference is, right? That's how we're going to be thinking about it here. So the idea then is that so just to recap a couple of things here, each premise and the conclusion should be a complete sentence, right? We don't want to just say Socrates alone because hey, this doesn't have its own truth value, right? Like there's nothing there to accept or reject. It's just a thing. Something like Socrates is a man, or Socrates is mean, or Socrates exists. Like those are things that are statements that we can accept or reject. And that's what we want to make sure each of our premises and our conclusion are all of, right? They're all statements that we can accept or reject. Down the line, we will be thinking about not just accepting versus rejecting. We'll get a little bit more fine-grained for those of you that are thinking like, wow, that's very binary just to think of like either accepting or rejecting something. Right? It's extremely important at this with what we're starting with, and you'll see how powerful the system is that we start with. But we will be looking at that and playing with that a little bit more. This idea of just binarily accepting or rejecting something. But it's important that we start here before we get to that more sophisticated system later. Right, the idea in general with logic is that we're just trying to differentiate between the good and the bad arguments, right? Which ones actually do justify what they're purporting to justify, and which ones don't, right? Last time we talked about how, yeah, based on these premises, these seem like actually pretty good reasons to accept Socrates is immortal, or was immortal, maybe. Whereas this is not a good inference, right? This is not a good argument, right? And so far we're just thinking about this in terms of intuition, but this week is our first week where we're really going to get a sense of, okay, what are those differences between good and bad? So that's what validity and soundness is all about. But before we really get into what validity is, what soundness is, heads up, validity is going to be a part of soundness. Let's look at a few examples of arguments. Let me move this up here. And let's just spend some time thinking about these. Right? What we want to do is we want to try to think about in what ways do we think these arguments are good and in what ways are they not good? Right? Now, just let me just give you also mention this color scheming, this blue and green does not correspond to the color scheming over here. Over here was premises versus conclusion. Over here, what I'm doing is I'm just trying to group these statements a bit more together just so that you can see maybe a little bit more of a pattern, if there is one. Just because otherwise I thought maybe a wall of black text wouldn't be particularly helpful. Okay, so in a moment I'm going to ask you just to pause and just think for a second specifically about what you think about each of these arguments. But before that, I'll give you a hint. Now, if you don't want that hint, go ahead and just pause now before it. But what I'm going to suggest is there's two ways in which these arguments are going to differ, right? Two ways in which we might say, okay, you're good at this, but you're bad at that, right? You're good at this part, but you're bad at that part, right? So two ways in which we might judge an argument or evaluate an argument. Okay, now maybe pause and try to think about what you think about each of these arguments and what you think those ways might be, how they might succeed or fail. Okay, so now let's think about each one. So if Socrates is a human, then he is mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore he is mortal. Okay, so this is the same argument that we had from before, and I guess you might have already had a spoiler. Well, I guess this might be slightly different, but you might that might have given you an idea that this one has something going for it. But what about the rest? If Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds. Socrates is an alien, therefore he can read minds. Oh, and by the way, these three dots here, sorry, this just means therefore. So let me go ahead and define that now for you. So you'll start to see this more because so logicians will often just use symbols. We'll start to use symbols more and more in this class to represent certain things. So instead of me writing just therefore at the end of these arguments, what I'm going to do is just give you these three dots here. Okay, so let me see if I can. Yeah, okay. And I want to make that. Oh, I can't. Okay. All right, so in each of these arguments, let's think. Let's think about first this question. Do we like, even if we like this first argument, right? If Socrates is a human, then he is mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore he is mortal, right? Like that sounds plausible. That sounds just like what we had before, right? The only way I would throw away the idea that Socrates is mortal is if either he's not a human or if being a human doesn't lead to you being mortal. But and I accept both of those things, generally speaking. So maybe let's look at this next one. If Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds. Socrates is an alien, therefore he can read minds. Okay. So let's see. I don't think Socrates is an alien, right? Like I think that's a false statement. So and based on that alone, right? If that's the justification for why I'm supposed to accept he can read minds, then I'm already like off. Like I'm not on board, right? I'm off the train. I'm like so. One way that we can say a sentence or an argument fails is that it's just based on false premises, right? So like one difference between this argument and this argument is that the first argument, it's based on true premises, right? If you're a human, you're gonna die eventually. I'm sorry, guys, this isn't a death and dying class, though we do offer that, right? Then Socrates is human, right? Then he is mortal. Right, that's a true statement, right? If you're human, then you're mortal. It's also true that he's human, right? However, this one is based on false statements. One, I'm at least not convinced about, but two, I'm certainly, I don't believe that. I don't believe Socrates is an alien. So like, let's start off with just saying, we can ask, are the premises actually true, right? That's one question we can ask. One way in which an argument can fail is that the premises might just be false, right? Because the point is we're trying to say based on these premises, we can reach this particular conclusion. So one question we can ask is, well, okay, are those premises actually true in the first place? So that's going to be one thing we can ask, and right, when we can come over here and ask those same questions, right? So like, are the premises actually true for the top left? Yes. The bottom left? No. How about the bottom right? Right? Are the premises actually true? Well, it's again telling me Socrates could read minds, or it's not again, but it's here, it's assuming that Socrates can read minds, right? It's treating that as a premise. It's saying, hey, based on believing this rule about aliens, that if you're an alien, you can read minds, and he can read minds, then we should accept that Socrates is an alien. And again, like, hey, I don't I don't accept this premise, right? So like the first way, so again, they're like just like before, this argument fails again because it's assuming something that's wrong. So the first way an argument in which an argument can fail is that it can just assume false premises, right? Like that your assumptions, your starting points can be bad, right? So like if I'm trying to justify some sort of scientific theory, but I start with bad data, right? Like I lied about the data, or like it came in with bad instrumentation or something like that, right? Like then it's a bad argument because I'm starting with a bad premise. So that's the first question we can ask. Are the premises actually true? So if we're going to ask, so maybe we can put this question. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping there. So let's just see. Are the premises actually true? So these first two arguments, yeah, they've got true premises, right? Both of them. The second pair of arguments, the bottom ones, both have false premises. They both assume something false. So this is our first question, right? Is just, are the premises actually true? Right? So now let's look a little bit more at this top right argument. If Socrates is a human, then he is mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore he is a human. Well, this one, right, doesn't sound right for some reason. Now, to be clear, it's assuming something that's true, two things that are true, in fact, right? It does assume that if Socrates is human, then he is mortal. And it's true, Socrates is mortal, right? Like, so, I mean, this is just a true assumption. Socrates is mortal. But does that guarantee that Socrates is a human? Right? What if, in this particular context, Socrates, I'm just talking about, right, like my pet turtle or something like that. Like, in that case, my point is just that, hey, Socrates is, this would still be a true statement, right? If my pet turtle were a human, then, yeah, my pet turtle would have been mortal still. My pet turtle is, in fact, mortal, but that doesn't mean my pet turtle is a human. Right? And notice there's something different about these two arguments. Even though they've got the same pair of statements, there's something different about the structure of those statements. Right? This one is saying, if you're a human, then you're mortal. And yes, Socrates is a human. So the if part is really true. Therefore, we can conclude the then part. Over here, though, we've got it backwards. We're saying if you're a human, then you're mortal. Same premise. But then we're saying the then part, right? Notice like this is if blue, then green. Blue, therefore green. This one's saying if blue, then green. Green, therefore blue. Now, we're going to spend more time on this next week. But like, let's just think a little bit about this sort of pattern here. I'll break it down over here. So let's say if maybe I won't use Socrates just so we can make it a little clearer. If Spot is a dog, then he is mortal, right? Spot is. Oh, wait, no. Spot is mortal. Therefore, Spot is a dog. Right? Notice like this doesn't work here. And it's not because Spot isn't actually mortal, right? Like I guess like to make this clear, maybe I should use like actually, yeah, I have a neighbor whose dog is Spot. So like just so that like we know we're talking about a real dog. I have a neighbor whose dog is Spot. So like that's who or whose pet is Spot, I should say. So if Spot is a dog, then he is mortal, and Spot is indeed mortal. But my neighbor's pet is actually, right, like, just because these things are true, my neighbor's pet could be still a cat, right? There's nothing in these premises that actually justify this, right? And maybe I'll use a non-dog name just to make this, because I want to make this nice and clear and explicit. So, like, if Tinkerbell sounds like a good pet name. Right? If Tinkerbell is a dog, then he is mortal. Tinkerbell is mortal, therefore Tinkerbell is a dog. Right? Like, these premises are both true. Right? It's true. If you're a dog, then you're mortal. I'm sorry. And it's true. Tinkerbell, right? Like, assuming I'm actually talking about a particular pet, right, that somebody has, is mortal, right? But that doesn't mean Tinkerbell is a dog. Tinkerbell might be some other animal. So the point is, having true premises isn't the whole story. There's also this question of, do your premises actually lead to the conclusion you're talking about, right? So, like, I mean, I could also have just, I could have my premises just being, right, Sean is a professor. Therefore, Sean is a dinosaur. Right? Like, that doesn't work, right? It's a true premise, but it doesn't lead to the conclusion, right? And that's the difference between the ones on the left here and the one on the right, right? It's got true premises, both of them. But the point is, here, the premises, accepting them, leads to the conclusion. Whereas on the right over here, if I accept the premises, that doesn't necessarily lead me to the conclusion, right? If over here, like, I'm going to try to do this nice and slowly. If I accept that being a human means you're mortal, and I accept that he's human, I have to accept, it would seem, that he's mortal. Right? The only way I don't think he's mortal is if he's not human, or if being human doesn't lead to being mortal, right? So the only way I don't accept the conclusion is if one of the premises failed, right? But the premises being true leads me to the conclusion being true, right? I'll paint that, I'll write that down in a moment just below. But over here, though, right, I can accept these premises all day long. Yeah, sure, if he's human, he's mortal. And he's mortal. That doesn't tell me he's actually human, though. Right? Right. If Tom Cruise is an actor, then he's rich. Tom Cruise is rich, therefore he's an actor. Well, no, I mean, he might have gotten rich some other way, right? I guess, that premise isn't true anyway. Most actors are poor, unfortunately. But anyway, so the idea is we have this first question about just, are the premises actually true? But then we have this other question, which we call validity. Okay, let's do it like this. Is it possible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true? Right? If I accept these premises, is it possible for me to give up that conclusion? In this case, if I accept that being human leads to being mortal, and I accept Socrates as a human, then I have to, in some sense, accept that Socrates is mortal. But over here, accepting he's mortal and accepting that being human leads to mortal doesn't mean he's human. He might be mortal some other way, right? He might just be a dog or a cat or a fish or whatever. So that's this second. Let me move that away. Right, that's this second question we can ask. So let me go ahead and put now a thing around these two. Right, and the idea is these are valid, which just means their premises if true, would require the conclusion to be true. Woof. Okay. Right, that's all we mean by valid. Which, right, like this concept of validity is going to be extremely important. Just a heads up. That's and we're gonna spend some time on it. So it's okay. So these ones are valid. And I guess I already kind of told you, but like not just the first one, but the second one too. Right? If Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds. Suppose that were true. Right? Validity is about thinking hypothetically in a large way. Right? Imagine that Socrates were an alien. And imagine that if you were an alien, then you could read minds. Then does it follow that he can read minds? Is there any possible way that he can't read minds if both of these were true? Right? In this case, if you reject that he can read minds, that either means that he's not an alien, or that being an alien doesn't lead to reading minds, right? Not all aliens can read minds. Again, this is a completely separate question from if the premises are actually true. Clearly, Socrates is not an alien. Like that's not what we're talking about here. It's not about what's actually true validity. Validity is about this possibility connection, right? Not about what is actually true, but just even hypothetically, right? This is where we're really getting into the logic here. It's about just the potential logical connection between these things, right? And so in these two cases, there's just no space left over. And again, we're going to talk about this not only next week, but for the remainder of the semester, just how this works and what we really mean by this. But here, in both of these, notice, and you might see a kind of pattern between what both of these arguments are doing, again, what we'll talk about next week. But the idea is that if we accept these premises, we just have to accept this conclusion. Right? Now, in the first one, I actually accept the premises. So, like, that gives it an extra bonus. In this one, I don't accept the premises. Right? So it got one thing right, but it got the other thing wrong. It got validity right, but it got true premises wrong. Right? This bottom left one. Okay. So, actually, let me go ahead and some sort of, right? Valid and true premises, and then valid with false premises, or yeah. Okay. So, right, we have valid with true premises and invalid with false premises. And over here, right, we already talked, wait, did I say, I called this invalid. This is not invalid, this is valid. Right, and so over here, right, we already said that this one has true premises, but on the other hand, right, we already talked about how just because I accept these premises doesn't mean I have to accept this conclusion, right? So this question, is it possible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true? Well, yeah, it's possible. It's possible for every single human to be mortal, and Socrates to be mortal, but Socrates just isn't a human. He's just a cat or something, right? In here, maybe that's because, right, like this is because maybe Socrates refers to something different than who we're really talking about or what have you. But like the point is nothing about these premises tells us that the conclusion follows. So this is what we call invalid. So right, so let me go ahead and do that, and change this to invalid. Right? And so down here we can see, right, if Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds, So we already talked about how this has false premises. right? I don't believe that he can read minds. But the other half of it is that even if I accepted that he could read minds, and even if I accepted that being an alien led to reading minds, that doesn't justify that he is an alien. Maybe he can read minds in some other way, right? Based on these premises, I can't rule that out. Notice the difference between the right and the left argument down here. Over here, it's not about, like, the point of the weirdness of this example is that we can, like, the premises can be weird. They can be false. That's not what validity is about, right? Here, I have a valid argument even though I have just as false premises. If Socrates is an alien, he can read minds. If he's an alien, yeah, I'd have to accept he can read minds. But over here, if Socrates is an alien, he can read minds. Same start premise, but now you're just telling me he can read minds. I don't know if, like, it's also the case that we haven't ruled out there aren't other sorts of mind readers. Maybe humans can read minds, right? We would need to put that in as a premise that only aliens read minds. Then you telling me reading minds would tell me that he's an alien. But based on these premises alone, you don't give me that information. So what that means is I can take, right? I can accept those premises without accepting the conclusion. Now, I don't accept the premises, but that's just the other question, right? That's the question of validity, or of false premises. So the point is that the four arguments here, right, show us the four different ways that things can fail, that arguments can fail. Sorry, let me fix this just slightly. Put that there. Right? So you could either have false premises, or right, you could have true or false premises, and you can have an invalid or a valid argument, right? Meaning you could either start from a bad place, or whether or not you start from a bad place, you can just take bad steps from there, right? So let me, just to finish this off, let me just put this. Right, and so let me put this here. So the idea is these ones are what we call invalid, right? Their premises, if true, right? Right, the premises can be true, and that doesn't mean the conclusion has to be true, is the point of invalidity. So, again, those are the two ways we can think about attacking an argument, or just think about, not necessarily attacking, but, like, evaluating your own arguments, right? Your own justifications for things. You can ask, okay, did I start with a correct belief? Like, was my evidence or my principle or whatever it is, was this accurate in the first place? And then I can ask, okay, now, did I take a valid step from there, right? Even if I started with true things, is it possible that I went to a false thing? In a valid argument, if you started with true things, then it's impossible that the conclusion is false. So the point of this is that when you add true premises to a valid argument, we get what we call a sound argument. And this is what we think in many ways of as just like the gold standard of arguments, right? Because think about it. If we have validity plus truth, then one, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. Like, that's what it means to be valid, that hey, as long as the premises are true, the conclusion has to be. But then adding to it the fact that we have true premises, well, hey, cool. That means with the validity part, my conclusion has to be true, right? So coming up here to the only one that gets both right, I'm justified, right? I know that the conclusion has to be true, right? If we know that, yeah, all humans are mortal, and we know that Socrates is immortal, or is a human, then yeah, it follows. We have a true conclusion. And that is what we're after, right? If we have false premises, even if it's valid, well, I don't have to accept the conclusion because I didn't accept where you started with. Or if we had true premises, but it's invalid, well, sure, you started at a good place, but you didn't take legitimate steps from there. So let me give you one last way to think about this. Suppose, right, somebody comes to you, or suppose you're a scientist, right? You're the scientist, or a scientist comes to you. Doesn't matter, right? And you're trying to use this data to justify some scientific claim, right? Like maybe you're trying to justify the idea that the water levels are rising or something, like from year to year, in the Platte River or something like that, right? And so you go and you take some data and you use that data and you do some math to that data, or whatever, right? Like you do some statistics on that data, and make some inferences to some conclusion, right? We could ask two questions about this, right? We can ask, okay, is the data itself accurate, right? Is the data itself like legitimate? Maybe it's maybe it was right. The measurements were mistakenly taken. Maybe there was some fabrication, right? Maybe one of your lab techs was just like really out to get you and they changed something, right? Or maybe there was just a complete accident, right? Something was miscalibrated. So we could ask, is the data itself accurate? And that is the question of truth and premises, right? Like, did we start in the right place? Or you can ask, or the other thing, and you can ask, right? Suppose we accept what the data says, right? Even if the data is true, does it lead to the conclusion, right? Does it lead to the result you think it's leading to? So one response you might have to a scientist that, right, or just anyone, right, is that, hey, I don't think these readings are accurate, right? That's a question of saying, hey, you have false premises, right? And this is what peer review in science is all about, by the way, or this is made in some ways a main part of it, or a backbone structure of it, right? And then validity is to say, well, no, yeah, your data was accurate, but you're just not getting to the right conclusion based on that data, right? You're not like your statistics are inaccurate, or like you're choosing the wrong methods to analyze that data, right? That's asking about the validity, right? Okay, suppose I accept where you started and what your initial measurements were. Did you do the correct analysis on those measurements? Right? So those are the two things we can ask. And if you get both of them, if you start with true data and you only do correct analysis, then we're good. Then we know we've got that true conclusion. Again, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be trying to really hone this particular structure and way of thinking about this as we go, and as we move along, we're going to be incorporating probability and how we can think about not just the binary questions, but maybe like to what extent like you might be unsure about something, and how can you induct and do that sort of thing. But for right now, what we're going to be trying to think about is just these two very, very simple, but you'll see very powerful questions. Just, are your premises true? And do those premises lead to your conclusion? Okay, I want to give you a couple more just examples to think about before we stop. So like, let's think. Let's just think about this. This one. I'm going to try to not have it match that format. At least, maybe that's how we'll have it sit at the end. Yeah, so I'll just put these. Okay, so what I want to do with these four arguments, just real quick, is I just want to give us some experience thinking about this a little bit more. which, so for each of these, we're going to ask two questions, right? So let me just copy these two questions down. For each of these, we're going to ask, are the premises actually true? And then we're going to ask, is it even possible for that conclusion to be false if we were to pretend that they were true? So, right, with validity, we're going to set aside whether or not they're actually true, right? These are independent questions completely. We're just going to pretend, hypothetically, if these premises were true, could the conclusion be false? If I was writing a story where the premises were true, could I include in that same story that conclusion being false? Or would that somehow be a contradiction or incoherent? Okay, so I'll let you guys have the power to pause, and I don't want to make this too long, so I'll go ahead and just go through these one by one. So let's think about this first one first. So all apples are fruits, all oranges are fruits, all apples are oranges, right? How do we feel about this one? So again, let's not just say it's good or bad. We need to ask, are the premises true and is it valid? So first, are the premises actually true? So let me go ahead and, well, that might be too much. Are the premises actually true? All apples are fruits. That is true. All oranges are fruits. That is also true. Now, the question, we don't just jump and ask, is the conclusion true? Right? It might seem obvious to you that it's not, but that's, like, again, we're trying to get away from just what seems obvious. We really need to try to stick to these questions very carefully. So we asked, are the premises true? And the premises here are actually true. So let me go ahead and just grab this here. And then we could ask, okay, now suppose that they're true. Is there any possible way for the conclusion to be false? And I mean, again, like I know I just said we can't be relying just completely on, we need to be staying safe to our definitions, right? Up here. But like at this point, we can only really check, is it possible at this point by just checking our intuitions at least a little bit. And in this case, well, right here in the real world, all apples are fruits, all oranges are fruits, but no, not all apples are oranges. Again, as we go, we're going to get a more precise way of deciding this. But here, it's at least intuitively clear that accepting these premises does not lead to accepting the conclusion, right? So we can go ahead and say this is not valid. Oops. Okay. So let's go ahead and put this, let's just put this to the side for right now. And then let's look at the second argument. So the second argument says all dogs are animals. All mammals are animals. Excuse me. All dogs are animals. All dogs are mammals, and therefore all dogs are animals. So goodness, I was trying to clean that up. All mammals are animals. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, all dogs are animals. So, right, in this case, let's ask these separately. First, is it true that every single mammal is an animal? Well, yes, right? Like that's right. No mammals or plants or funguses or anything like that. All mammals are animals, right? We're part of that branch in biology. All dogs are mammals, right? That's also true. Every single dog is, again, just is part of the branch of mammals. So these are two true premises. We can also ask just in general, right? Is it possible for these premises to be true but the conclusion to be false? Is it possible for all dogs to be mammals, all mammals to be animals, but not every single dog to be an animal? And, right, again, like, at this point, we're still on the level of the intuition, but let me try to draw this out. Maybe it will get us a little bit further. If I say that all dogs exist in the mammals circle, right? That's what premise 2 tells me. But then premise 1 tells me that, but all mammals are just a part of the larger animal circle. I need to get my text below. There we go. Right? Here's a visual demonstration for why we should think, okay, yeah, no, all dogs then, look, they're also inside the animal circle. There's no way for me to keep the dog circle inside the mammal circle without it simultaneously being inside the animal circle. So yes, this conclusion follows from these two premises. Right? So in this case, we've got true premises, we've got a valid argument structure. So we'll put that right there. And we'll put our little reminder of that just above it right there. Okay, now let's look at this one. If something is a planet, then it is made of cheese. Mars is a planet, therefore it is made of cheese. Well, okay, so let's first ask, do we have true premises? So if we have a planet, does that mean it's made out of cheese? Unfortunately, no. That is not a true statement. So already we know that we have false premises. And I really should put a parenthesis around the S because I don't know, because I'm not necessarily claiming that both premises are false there, just that at least one is. And that's all, to be clear, that's all that we need for the argument in general to fail, is if one premise fails, right? That's why in general we try to keep the number of premises lesser, because it's like keeping the number of weak points fewer. Number of premises fewer keeps the number of weak points fewer. So in this case, right, even though Mars is a planet, we're still going to say it has a false premise. So we're still going to give it an X on that. Now let's think about, just as a separate question, is it valid, right? Is it impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true? And here, if we accepted these premises, yeah, we should definitely accept that conclusion, right? If it's true that something being a planet means it's made out of cheese, and it's true that Mars is a planet, then really we should accept Mars is made out of cheese. The only way for Mars to not be made out of cheese is if it's not a planet, or if being a planet doesn't actually mean you're made out of cheese. So in this case, right, it is a valid argument, because I would reject the conclusion, and in doing so, particularly I would reject it because I reject that first premise. So the point here is that we do have a valid argument. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and squeeze that one in right there. We'll go ahead and do it too. Okay. So finally, let's look at this one. Let's scoot these guys over. All fish can fly. Salmon are fish. Therefore, salmon can breathe underwater. Right? So here's an example of hopefully one that's clearly invalid, right? I can believe all fish can fly and that salmon are fish without believing that salmon can breathe underwater, right? Like, there's nothing, like, even if fish can, like, in this particular situation, the point is, even though salmon might actually be able to breathe underwater, that's not our question for validity, right? So like here, to be clear, I'm talking about validity. So like the premises are obviously, the first premise is obviously false. So let me go ahead and just get that out of the way first, I suppose. Okay, so we have at least one false premise. Yes, salmon are fish. But the point is, there's nothing in these premises that would force me to believe that salmon breathe underwater, right? If we're thinking hypothetically, and all you've told me is that fish can fly and that salmon are fish, then like potentially salmon are things that breathe outside of water, right? There's nothing in these premises that tell me that salmon can breathe underwater, right? So it's very important that like it's not just left up to your intuitive knowledge, like, yeah, that conclusion is true, or like, yeah, I believe that, because I do believe salmon can breathe underwater. The question is it based on the premises? Like, if we assume the premises is true, does that guarantee the conclusion? And if they don't guarantee, if they don't have enough in them to force us to believe the conclusion, then we say that the argument as a whole is invalid. Just over there. Okay. So these examples, right, I've just set them up just to match up there. The idea, again, just to say it one last time, is that for any argument, right, it's trying to tell us that here are some premises that are trying to support a conclusion. So for any argument, and this is true, like just in terms of how you can structure your own way of evaluating what people tell you and your own arguments, you can ask, did they start at a true spot, like these top ones did? And then did they only make legitimate steps, like these left ones did? Because if they did both of those things, like this top left one did, then we should really accept that conclusion. When it seems that they've actually justified, right? That's what they've actually justified that conclusion. So we're going to talk about this more next week. In general, just so you know, in logic, what we're really going to be concerned with is particularly this validity thing. So, right, like I know that's the more difficult concept to wrap your head around this week, but that's really what we're going to be, I mean, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for us spending the rest of the semester on it, because it is more difficult. But that's the real question in logic is, when is it that your premises really lead to the conclusion? When is it that assuming the premises were true really does force you to accept that the conclusion is always true, right? That's particularly going to be what we're concerned with. Okay, guys, let me know if you have any questions as always, and take care out there.